Well, our next speaker will be Dr. Randy Price. Dr. Price is an adjunct assistant professor and agricultural engineer with the Louisiana State University AgCenter. He has numerous peer-reviewed publications and patents that have resulted from his research career. Dr. Price is currently focused on application technology and precision application issues, and will be discussing the nuts and bolts of unmanned aircraft systems, including sensors, building, and testing. So I'm going to turn the microphone over to Dr. Price.
Thanks, Jim, and good afternoon to everybody who's out there. Like Jim said, my name's Randy Price, and I work for the LSU AgCenter. And instead of being located at a main university level, I'm actually located out in a field office. And so a lot of my presentation will be why I'm here, and that's to really help the farmers and producers understand these devices and what they can do with them. And that's kind of what we concentrated on. We do a little bit of research, but a lot of that research is spurred on by questions that the farmers ask. And Louisiana contains a lot of different crops, so sometimes our questions are quite different, you know, than maybe the people in the Midwest address. For instance, like we have rice fields, and it's always a question, well, what if I, land my UAV in the rice field? Well, we've got to look at ones that are waterproof and different attributes and things. So we do have a lot of different needs here that can tend to vary from some of the other states. I'll talk a little bit about the unmanned aircraft and agriculture and some of the stuff we found out about these units. First of all, we always get a question a lot of the farmers ask, what's the possible uses in farming? And at least in Louisiana and probably across the country, there's a lot of uses for these devices. One of the main uses that we've heard about is the overhead imagery of crops and fields. This has been going on probably since the 60s and 70s and 50s. There's been remote sensing. People have wanted to use it to tell things about their crops and do a better job applying either nutrients or fertilizer, or somehow get a value increase on their farming areas. Well, in the past, that's been extremely hard. We had satellites and things. They worked good, but there was cloud covers. The visit times weren't quite high enough, things like that. You had to deal with, a party in between you and the actual photos to where you had to pay to get it, and lots of other things. So, there's also manned aircraft. Those have been used in the past. We've used them in the past. Also work pretty well, but you still got a little bit of expense trying to get the airplane to where you're at. Sometimes that person's flying, an hour or two away, which isn't very far in an airplane, but by the time he gets to the field you want to take a picture of, it's cloudy or something's not quite right, and it goes home, and then we just never get the photos. So we're kind of hoping that these UAVs, and what we're seeing is they're going to probably give you as an individual a real tool to get out there and get high quality, really quick photos and imagery of fields in a fast manner that you kind of control. Like if you go out there and it looks like a nice day, you can just go out and get that data. We've had a lot of talk here in Louisiana. There's a lot of crop scouting and crop consultants, and these devices will have a high possibility of helping them be able to get up over a crop. Instead of an oblique view where you can't really see much, we can get up kind of high and really hopefully define the areas where you may want to do some checking for insect damage and things like that. We always get this type request, and that's even taking images of machinery and farmsteads. Every time we've been out flying a field, sometimes there's harvesting operations or something like that going, and the farmer's just curious, hey, I'd like to see what it looks like from the air with my machinery harvesting, and it's always kind of interesting to see. And while he's looking at that, a lot of times he'll see his field and he'll notice variances and say, oh, that's weird, those 3 or 4 strips or rows are completely different than the other, and then it causes him to think back and think, well, what happened there? Is that a different variety? Did the fertilizer truck run out of fertilizer? Things like this, so it seems to help out. I know in the Midwest we don't have as much center pivot irrigation here, but trying to check nozzles and things in irrigation systems is a very lucrative use for these. Here in Louisiana we do have a lot of flood irrigation, and these have been theorized, even tested last year to try and get to the back of fields. At first you think, well, that's not a hard problem, but some of these fields are about 300 feet long. You're trying to flood irrigate them, and the farmer wants to know when the irrigation water hits the back of the field so he can turn the pump off. Well, a lot of these fields you can't drive back behind them, and now with poly pipe and quarter drains and stuff, it makes it even harder to get back there. So there's a lot of theory. Even some of the visual feedback from these devices will be used for that. Of course, spraying is a big one. Here in Louisiana, there's a ton of spraying that goes on because of rice fields and things like that. A lot of these fields are being encroached by suburban areas, and they're still in production for rice. We want to, keep our good land in production if we can to make food. And but the airplane pilots are having a hard time getting into these areas, with something as big as an airplane. So it's theorized, and even some of the airplane pilots are interested in this, that this might be a side business for them to run. UAV is an aeronautical aircraft. It's going to be governed a little bit by the FAA. That they may have a small business where they take these units out, and even though they can't cover a lot of acres, they may be able to cover the hot spots, where they don't want any drift near, vegetables, crops, tomatoes, maybe a person's house, things like this. So even though that doesn't sound that practical because of the weight that's required to, lift spraying systems, it does make some sense on the small side. So there's always checking farm areas. We've already had cattle people using these. They don't want to drive to the back of the field because it may be muddy, they got open gates, things like that. They're starting to use these where they'll fly to the back of the field and actually count their cows and then fly back. They need to drive in, then they'll drive in. If not, they'll go to the next, the next thing they want to check. So there's lots of uses for these things. I know personally we've used them several times, and I can't highlight the fact that the best thing is it doesn't care if the ground's wet, dry, or anything. As long as it's good enough weather to fly it, you just fly it over the field, and there's no trampling of the crop or anything like that, and they're fast and they get the job done. So talk a little bit about the main types of UASs, and there are a couple more than these, but these are kind of the main ones that we currently see today. The first one is these multi-rotors. These allow vertical takeoff and landing. They can have anywhere from 4 to 8 propellers in a circle, usually around a disc where everything's mounted. Do note that these do all the lifting power of the weight via the propeller and motor power. So typically these aren't as efficient as an airplane or wing aerodynamics that's flying through the air. Because of that, they're usually quite a bit slower. They have to tilt and get offset gravity, and a little bit of motor propulsion. They got to hold their weight up as they move forward. Because of that, they're typically limited to about 10 to 20 miles per hour. There are some that go faster than that, but if you're using an automated flight and you're trying to fight a 10 mile per hour wind, you don't want it to stall out. So usually in an automated flight, you're using these things at about 15 miles per hour. All of these are battery only. There are some newer stuff coming out, that's gas generator assisted. There's some fuel cells coming out that'll help these things. But typically, because these rotors have to turn off and on really fast to maintain stability, most of the energies have to be turned into electricity, and that's what power these things. Because they're battery only, you got to stick quite big batteries in there, and you have to charge quite a few batteries to do this. And the time of flight is greatly limited to about 10 or 20 minutes max. The second type is these airplanes. Now, usually the people use airplanes. That's when they want to cover a lot more acres. The reason for that is because the airplanes have a lot higher efficiency with the amount of motor power. These can cover usually 200 or 300 acres per battery, and you can get that many you can cover that amount of acres, in some reasonable time, 30, 40 minutes. It gets kind of hard to do a 300-acre field with the current multi-rotors that we have, because you basically have to make 3 or 4 different flights, landing each time and redoing a battery, and it takes quite a while to get it, take off and land that many times. The airplanes do fly a lot faster, 20 to 70 miles per hour. We have ones that do 60, but do keep in mind that when you put a camera in these, you're kind of limited by that resolution. Like Alex said, how quickly can your camera take a picture and not skew the images or the pixels? And because of that, we found out, usually even though we had an airplane, because of the download speeds of the images and the continuous taking of images by the camera, you could only fly at about 25 miles an hour to actually get overlap to where you could fill in a mosaic with these devices. So do keep that in mind. You could have a fast one, but your camera's also got to be able to keep up. One bad thing about the airplanes is the takeoff and landing. We have both types. We used to kind of like the airplane because it seemed a little bit safer because it was styrofoam, in case it hit something, fell out of the sky, hit somebody's car, something like that. But anymore, we kind of tend to like the multi-rotors, and that's because the airplanes, you never know if they're going to fly until you just throw it up there and let it go. And you say, well, I get it all tuned up, and I know it flies good, and that's true. But usually when these things sit in your car, your truck, or your vehicle, because they're made out of styrofoam and some other things. The elevators can get a little twisted, things like that, and you never know until you throw it up. So we tend to like the helicopters now, or the multi-rotors, because you can ease it up off the ground, make sure everything's working right before you fly away. Some of the typical components you might need if you're deciding on getting one of these, and these are kind of an older set. I'll show you a newer system that's now coming out this year that you might be interested in. But usually got to get the multi-rotor helicopter, which is this device. You're going to need some batteries. Usually we recommend people to get 2 or 3 or 4 batteries. And by the way, these batteries do seem to wear out with time. Usually we replace them about every 3 to 4 months. A lot of the crashes that we have had that have been very localized crashes, you know, doing some testing, making sure stuff fly right, was because we had an older battery in that unit. So keep that in mind. You want to keep fresh batteries. They're not really that much, about $100 a piece. That may sound like a lot, but when you got a UAV system that's anywhere from 2 to 10,000, that's really not that much. Usually there's some type of camera in this device to give you the NDVI or RGB imagery. We'll talk a little bit more about those, but you have to usually buy something that goes on your UAV if it didn't come with it. You'll need some chargers and things. There's a little bit of learning on how to charge this stuff up. You know, you can learn it on your own, or lots of universities are giving training sessions on for sure by now. We do, to where, you know, they'll teach you a little bit how to do that and get you up to speed really quickly. Usually there's a type of ground control station. Usually it runs on a laptop or a tablet. You don't actually usually have to have this to fly the UAV. You can fly it manually, or, you know, stabilized or in certain features just between the radio and the UAV. But we do recommend everybody use this. The reason is the feedback about safety systems, if you got enough GPS satellites, things like this, it's always recording the paths. If something does get a little bit flaky or seem weird, this thing will record it, and you can look back and sometimes figure out, you know, what's wrong. Well, I lost some GPS satellites, or the battery for some reason was losing energy, things like that. So keep that in mind. We do highly recommend you use that. I will mention that there's very few laptops out there today that are sunlight readable. So we've tried cheap ones, and we've tried the really expensive ruggedized ones. And I do recommend that if you have the extra money, you know, I know they're $2,000 or $3,000 or $4,000, but those ruggedized laptops usually have screens now that are sunlight readable, and they really help out. Last part I want to talk about is a radio. Do note a lot of this stuff still has half a foot in the RC airplane industry. And because of that, a lot of the radios you'll see with these UAVs are based on the radios from that industry. One bad thing is, one good thing is these radios are very good because they've been around for a while, but one bad thing is the switches are very rarely well marked on these radios. And with these UAVs, you have lots of switches for return to launch, land immediately, automated flight, stabilized flight, all kinds of things. You really need to know where those switches are, and I do highly recommend that you label it on your radio if you end up with a regular radio. Some of the newer units are getting away from that, and they're actually do a better job labeling that stuff. Talk about some of the newer systems, and if you're, you know, thinking about purchasing or getting something this year, this would probably be something you want to look at. These systems aren't as high end, you know, may only cover about 30 or 40 acres per flight, but we're finding out these things are so easy to fly, and they're coming with tablet type software that's very easy to use and low cost. This is an example of one we built where we bought a Phantom 3. I do recommend you get the advanced or professional model, as it has a high-end Wi-Fi system built in between the UAV and the radio, and that allows HD or higher quality video to be transmitted between the units. First you think, well, video is not really necessary, and it's not for, you know, recording farms for layers or maps. But a lot of times you'll find out you want the video to go check your cows or something like that, and it just comes in comes in handy. Another thing is, because it's digital with that Wi-Fi type transmitter, they can send a lot of extra data back and forth, you know, tell you a lot of things about what the UAV is doing, you know, is it stabilized, things that are going wrong, not going wrong, things like that. Now, we did some testing, and amazingly enough, you wouldn't believe these Wi-Fis are rated for 3.1 miles, and we couldn't really believe that because we had some farmers coming back going like, hey, I'm flying my UAV, you know, like 1.6 miles out. I don't recommend you do that. The FAA has said pretty strictly, there's no rules yet, but they are recommending you keep it under 400 feet and within line of sight. And at about 1.6 miles out, I'm not sure you're going to see that little unit anymore. But we have flown it about a mile away, still seeing that unit, and it seems to work at least up to a mile away. So I would rough guess it as about a mile and a half. Usually we find most transmitters that we buy, if they're rated for 3 miles or 4 miles, we usually get about half that, and at good stability and quality. So if you don't want to build your unit, I will tell you, we actually did take this camera apart and put in a lens and a filter we'll talk about, so it sees NDVI. Most of these see RGB. We'll talk about that in a minute. But there are units sold right now, $3,000 to $4,000 range, that have already been converted to see NDVI. And like I said, we're finding if you're a novice flyer, things like that, no RC experience, these things are very easy to fly, and people can pick them up with about 30 minutes of training and go out there and play around and become pretty good pilots with time. I want to talk about something you should consider before you buy a UAV and think you're just going to create a map. Like Alex said, there's a lot of steps to getting these mosaics made. And even beyond that, if you want to get past the mosaic and get it into your precision farming software, that creates even more work to do that, to try and get some nutrient levels or some type of rate controller file made. But the thing is, because these, the FAA has said try and keep them under 400 feet, we don't want to mix them up with a manned aircraft yet because they don't have any type of obstacle avoidance systems. They go from point A to point B. They really don't care what's in the middle. The automated flight works really good on these. We haven't had any problem with that, but they are kind of dumb objects in the air. Because of that, the FAA said keep them under 400 feet. Well, when you do that, like Alex was saying, that creates a problem with the field of view of the images. On most fields, there is space in between the crops growing at the times you want to take pictures to detect things. So because of that, you really need a camera to look straight down to see, the crop and the row space in between. Lots of times in bad areas, you'll end up with more row space, and that helps you see what you want. So do keep in mind that we've done a lot of testing, and if you have a 50-acre field, which a multi-rotor can do, you'll end up with about 1 to 200 of these images. If you have a 200-acre field and you got lots of overlap, we've ended up with 500 images. When you try to put these images together, it really takes a lot of horsepower on a computer. We've had times, like for instance, like when we had 500 images, it took literally 10 hours on a laptop we bought last summer for $800, which isn't extremely powerful, but it did everything I wanted to do pretty well, except for this. It took about 10 hours to put that mosaic together. So this may not be something you're going to do in your truck when you're setting at the field. Maybe something you're still going to have to go back to the office, make a map. Turnaround time will probably be at least half a day or more, or 1 day to get that image made if you work on it. So do note that if you do a smaller field, 30, 40 acres, you could probably get that turned around in about an hour or two. Talk a little bit about the two main types of cameras currently. Alex talked a lot about these high-end cameras that they're getting, which is super. These have just come out, are just now coming out, and you're seeing them everywhere. But last year and the year before, there wasn't so many of these high-end specialized cameras. What we kind of ended up using was these consumer cameras, and there's a lot of internet literature on these that you can go out and read, where they'll take a consumer camera and they will actually take that camera and change out a filter on the in the middle, in between it. And you can read up how to do this. This is something you can actually do yourself if you like. Well, these blocking filters work pretty well, and what they do is they'll actually get rid of the red band by blocking that out, and then they'll allow the NIR band to fill that position. So the camera still sees 3 bands, but instead of seeing red, green, and blue, it actually sees NIR green and blue. Now, one problem that creates is a lot of our current data on vegetative indices and biomass and health about crops has been based on NDVI red. And you can get on the internet and read up quite a bit more about NDVI. But it's a vegetative index that seems to help you see the things you want when you use these cameras in these different wavelengths. Well, we've had a lot of producers that ask, well, does that really see the same thing as, let's say, the Greenseeker? So we did a lot of testing last year to try and figure that out. Are we seeing the same differences? The differences we want to see in production agriculture And really, when we did all this data, what we found out was we did pretty much see the same differences at the, nearly the same sensitivity level as the Greenseeker. And, sometimes you're going to have NDVI based on green or blue. That's what you get with that camera if you don't have a second camera that you put with it. And a lot of people don't, because when you start doing the extra layers of data, it gets time consuming. Sometimes NDVI green worked better and sometimes NDVI blue. But they did seem to see the good and bad areas in a field per field setting. Now, that changes. Varieties would change the curve, or not. It was always a proportional curve, but it would change the values on that curve. So they didn't match the Greenseeker perfectly. They might be half the values, or some proportional factor to the values. So keep that in mind. But we did see a pretty good relationship between those. This is just an example of the fields, or this will show you a map field that we did with the Greenseeker versus NDVI green flown with the UAV, and I think this was an S100, Canon S100 camera. And if you look at the picture on the right, oops, this is the Greenseeker version. This took about an hour and a half to go with the UTV with the Greenseeker out the back. Lots of traveling across that hay meadow just to get that data. Here was the NDVI from the UAV, which took literally about 10 minutes to fly. So you can see the areas, look, we got the same high and low areas, which is really what we wanted in the end, to make a producer's call or some type of call about the vegetative index at that point. Do note that the resolution was much better on this, and Alex alluded to that. The resolution of these cameras is extremely good. Those are hay bales that were in this hay field. When you go over to the Greenseeker data, of course, we couldn't run over the hay bales, and because of the field of view, you're not really going to pick that up anyway. You couldn't see that. So, yeah, the NDVI from the UAV map looked quite a bit better in that respect. We already talked a little bit about this, but I do want to highlight one other thing. Do note that we didn't put in right here, but there is an extra step here, and you should know this. A lot of these mosaic softwares, which we'll talk about in a minute, they make a mosaic, but they still don't make the NDVI, which involves doing a difference between two of the bands and then dividing by the two bands. So the problem with that is a lot of times to get the right sensitivity, you have to do some manual scaling or know what you're doing with the standard deviation of the values to really see that. And I think, and I don't know this for sure, but it seems like the manufacturers haven't embraced that very much in a lot of this mosaicing software. So we actually use a third piece of software, or a second piece of software, AgPixel, which isn't sold anymore. There's ImageJ and some other programs that'll do this, but you do have to get quite good at making that NDVI image, usually before you put into your precision farming software. I think, I could be wrong, but I think SMS Ag Leader may do some of that for you also, so keep that in mind. These are the two software packages currently that you can get to do this mosaicing. Do keep in mind, these are pretty expensive. Let's say you get a UAV for anywhere from $600 to, let's say you spend $3,000 or $4,000 for it. Well, this software just to make these mosaics is about $3,500 to $8,000, okay? And it used to be $12,000 last year. The reason this software is so expensive, there's just a few companies that do it, and it also is based on some 3D imaging technique, which is quite interesting. The people that invented this software or do this software, instead of saying we're going to have all this type of attitude data, tilt data, and things like this embedded in the imagery, we just need kind of a good location, somewhat of a GPS location between the images, and then we're going to have the images try to do 3D matching in the imagery. That's why some of this imagery can be used for volume fills and things like that in quarries, and it uses that to try and put the images back together. Now that gets quite hard in a crop that's homogeneous when you're out in the middle, and the only feature is one picture of a crop that looks like the next picture of crops. But it can do it. We found out it does work pretty well. Just takes a lot of processing power for it to do that, and that's what I alluded to in those other images. Do note that if you're a university, AgCenter does have an educational discount for $500. You can get that, which really helps out, but they are quite expensive. Processing time, I will tell you, we talked a little bit about this. We were looking at, for a 200-acre field, sometimes it was taking 10 hours. I will tell you that we got the idea. We had a lot of producers saying, well, how can I get this done in a timely manner? And so we were kind of tasked with looking at that. So we started looking at the different computers and kind of said, well, what if we just didn't buy a laptop? That's not really a very high-end computer. Let's buy something that's locally available but still higher end. So we decided to look at some of the gaming computers. So we actually bought a gaming computer that contained really the best non-server quality processor there is, and that was like an Intel i7 5640, I think. 16 logical processors, 3 gigahertz, hyper-threading, so it runs double speed, things like that. The best processor Intel made that was still a desktop type processor, and when I say that, it only uses 140 watts. It's not like these dual server things that are burning like 500 watts and things like that. We want it to still be somewhat usable without producing a lot of heat. We actually got that 10-hour processing time down to 2 hours for 500 images. And on a manageable field like 40 or 50 acres, we were down to 20 minutes processing time. So it is possible to do that, and you'll probably see a lot of laptops, or hopefully those type of processors in the next several years will be available on the less expensive laptops and things. Do note, you don't always have to do the mosaic yourself. There's a lot of online mosaicing occurring. Usually these have a subscription per month. Some of them will sell you the UAV, and then for a cheap price, they'll let you get online. They'll do the mosaics for you, things like that. These do seem to work pretty good. Usually the time to analyze is just like what we had, about a half a day, 3 or 4 hours to half a day to 1 day. We did notice that on some of the images we did send out, when they did the NDVI for you, which was kind of nice, it might come back with only 2 layers, 2 different levels, and we really wanted to see 4 different levels. And so they tended to smooth some stuff together that we didn't want. But it did work good. It does need somewhat of a good internet connection, but usually if you go back to your office, that works just fine. We already talked about needing the NDVI. Keep that in mind, that even though if you get a mosaic, a CIR image, you're still going to probably need to convert it to NDVI. I've had people ask me in the past, and I've always wondered this, why don't I just look at an RGB, which is a visual camera image, or if I have a CIR image, when I look at that, why do I need NDVI? I don't have data to prove this, but we kind of have noticed that when you look at visual imagery, there's just way too much detail. You're seeing good and bad spots and things you kind of really don't want to see because it's just an overload on what you're trying to do in the field. When you convert it to NDVI, it seems to transform it in a way that you'll end up 3 or 4 different levels in the field that are the large levels that you really want, where the crops are good or bad. We'll look at a couple images here, and then we'll be done. Here's some example images. This on the left is a CIR image. They call that color infrared. The reason is because all computers and cameras usually see 3 colors, red, green, and blue. So if you substitute an NIR, that's not something we visually see. So it produces this color infrared image. Usually color infrared, the more pink it is, but it could be blue or something depending on how how you have your NIR stuck in your RGB levels. Usually the more pink it is, the higher biomass. Here's the NDVI images. Now this was soybean fields that were purposely infected with insect and weed damage, and you can pretty much see there's large differences that it detected in there. Here's just I just threw this in because I thought this was kind of a neat field. This is one we flew during the off years, when crops aren't growing, and what we were trying to record was where the volunteer corn had come up. So you got to get rid of this or spray it. I don't know why, maybe just let it go till next year. Well, what was funny was you can see the volunteer corn in the middle here. Here's the NDVI where it lies. If you start thinking about the history of this field, this is actually where the drainage flows in that field. This field isn't leveled, and not land leveled, somewhat leveled from the past, but not land leveled by today's standards. And this is actually the drainage through that field, and this is typically the wetter area. It is good to know some background about your field. Lots of times we see bad spots. Farmer will come out and they'll go, oh, that's where they put in cable beside the field in our field, and that ground's more compacted. And then he looks at it and goes, that's funny, I didn't know it caused that much difference in the crop growth. So a lot of times the farmer who has a history of the field can explain why that area maybe grows better or not as good in a lot of these fields. This is kind of interesting. You don't always have to do georectification to find out what you want. This is a field we had in north central Louisiana. where they applied herbicide, and they were doing different application rates. It was kind of a test for a chemical company, and they were trying different things on different soil type, and I think this was a sandy soil, and the application rate burned the soybeans really bad. Now, what they wanted was, the farmer who had all these 300 acres with this, chemical company was going to pay him back for the loss of the crop, but they really couldn't figure out the percentage area that was damaged. So we flew the UAV up, and within about an hour of the guy just looking at the images, he came up with a pretty good estimate of the damage that they were going to pay the person on. So it worked out good in that case, just getting the UAV up there and looking at the individual imagery. Here's another one that's this is also soybeans, and if you noticed, this is the high vegetation area. This was an irrigation test where we had good irrigation on the left side of the field, and then they purposely shut the pumps off early to cause bad irrigation on the right side of the field. So you can pretty much see how the crop didn't grow very well from the left to the right. Also in this field, if you look where I put the arrow, there was hog damage, and they kind of wanted to quantify that. This was a test plot, and they didn't want to add those areas into their values. So you can see right here where this is where wild hogs had come into this field and did some damage. All right, currently one thing to keep in mind, and we're almost done, is when you evaluate this imagery, there's still no equations really to tell what you're going to see in the actual field. It's not like push button where I can say, oh, here's my UAV, it flew it, here's the numbers, here's what it means for nitrate application. There's lots of variants, and you still got to go out and figure out what caused it, whether it's soil compaction, areas of texture that just don't grow things as well, irrigation problems, all kinds of things. And that's where you need a consultant, or you yourself may have to go out there and put some smarts to what you're seeing. Talk a little bit about the economics, and this is kind of based on last year. This is changing drastically. We had some people that asked, what's the real economics between buying this myself or building it myself, all the pieces, or just buying a CAN system? There are CAN systems out there using a $10,000 to $20,000 range that will provide everything for the UAV, the camera, even the online mosaicing and stuff like that. Typically, those somewhere between $10,000 and $20,000. And when we found out we tried to build an all-in-one system, by the time to buy the software or get a high-speed computer, maybe the UAV and stuff, you really got about the same amount of money into it. So you may be able to shave off a couple $1,000s or $3,000, but keep that in mind when you do this. Now these online softwares where you just have online, subscription or something, they may change this where you can get a UAV for $2,000 or $3,000 and then be able to use their online service and keep your costs way down. All right, so conclusion is UAS flights seem to be pretty good, more available. We're finding the computers work great into things. Flying a path works great. There's still some work that's got to be doing the imagery, putting it together, things like that. But that is coming along. It's getting better all the time. I should mention on those some of the tablet software that's now come out. We bought a software from Pix4D, an app that'll do the mosaicing for you. It's $500 a year, and it automatically downloads the imagery from the UAV, sends it to them, and then they send it back, which is another step to making it more push-button approach. All right, and with that, I'll end this talk and answer any questions if there's any.
Okay.